It's just a tattoo. One laughed. 3 minutes later, the Marines saw the veterans' code and lined up. Look at Grandpa's ancient ink. Chad Morrison's voice boomed across the crowded diner, his finger pointing mockingly at the elderly man sitting alone in the corner booth. What is that supposed to be, some kind of caveman drawing? If this incredible story of hidden heroism and unexpected honor moves you, please like and subscribe for more amazing tales that will restore your faith in humanity. 74-year-old Arthur Art Castellanos felt every eye in Murphy's diner turn toward him as laughter erupted from the group of young men at the counter. His weathered hand instinctively moved to cover the faded tattoo on his forearm, a design so old and worn that its original details had blurred into an indecipherable mass of blue-green ink against his age-spotted skin. Seriously, old man. Chad continued, emboldened by the snickers from his friends. Did you get that done in prison? Because it looks like someone used a rusty nail and shoe polish. Art's coffee cup trembled in his grip as shame burned through his chest. The tattoo that had once been his pride, sharp, clean lines depicting an eagle perched on a globe with an anchor beneath it, was now barely recognizable after 5 decades of sun age and the natural fading that came with time. To these young men, it was nothing more than a curiosity, a relic worthy of ridicule. Maybe it's a map to buried treasure. Another voice chimed in, causing fresh waves of laughter to ripple through the diner. Or directions to the nearest nursing home. Art started to rise from his seat, his arthritic joints protesting as he reached for his wallet to pay for the coffee he'd barely touched. The humiliation was complete. In a place where he'd eaten breakfast every Wednesday for 3 years, he was being treated like a sideshow attraction by people young enough to be his grandchildren. But as Art struggled to his feet, his sleeve rode up slightly, revealing more of the tattoo that had caused such amusement. And in that moment, 8-year-old Ethan Rodriguez, sitting with his grandmother at a nearby table, caught sight of something the laughing men had missed entirely. Abuela, Ethan whispered urgently, tugging on his grandmother's sleeve. Look at that man's tattoo. There's something written underneath it. Arthur Castellanos had never intended for his story to become invisible. After serving 2 tours in Vietnam as a Marine Corps reconnaissance specialist, earning a Bronze Star for valor, and a Purple Heart for wounds sustained during the siege of Quezon, Art had returned home to San Antonio in 1971, expecting to resume the life he'd left behind. Instead, he found a country that seemed embarrassed by its returning warriors, a society that preferred to forget the war entirely rather than honor those who had fought it. The tattoo on his forearm had been inked by a fellow Marine in Da Nang during a brief respite between missions. It was a masterpiece of military artistry, the eagle globe and anchor of the Marine Corps, rendered in exquisite detail with Semper Fi inscribed in bold letters beneath it, and below that in smaller script 2nd Recon BN, and the dates of his service. The tattoo artist, a lance corporal named Jimmy Santos from Brooklyn, had been killed 2 weeks later by a sniper's bullet, making Art's tattoo one of the last pieces of artwork Jimmy would ever create. For decades, Art had worn the tattoo with quiet pride, a permanent reminder of the brotherhood he'd found in the Marines and the men who hadn't made it home. He'd built a successful career as a construction foreman, married his high school sweetheart Rosa, and raised 3 children who moved away to pursue their own dreams in other cities. Rosa had passed 5 years ago, and Art now lived alone in the small house they'd shared for 47 years, his daily routine consisting of morning coffee at Murphy's Diner, afternoon walks around the neighborhood, and evenings spent watching old war movies that reminded him of a time when his life had purpose and meaning. Murphy's Diner had become Art's anchor to the outside world, a place where he could sit among other people and feel less alone with his memories. The diner was located in a working-class neighborhood that had seen better days, its clientele a mix of retirees, shift workers, and young families struggling to make ends meet. The owner, Margaret Murphy, was a kind woman in her 60s who had always treated Art with respect, but she'd recently hired several younger employees who seemed to view the elderly customers as relics from a bygone era. Chad Morrison was the worst of them, a 24-year-old part-time server and full-time community college student who worked at the diner to pay for his business administration classes. Chad had grown up in an era when military service was voluntary rather than mandatory, when wars were fought by a small percentage of the population, while the majority went about their daily lives unaffected. To Chad, veterans like Art were historical curiosities rather than living reminders of sacrifice and service. The generational divide was stark and painful. Chad's friends, all in their 20s and early 30s, had no frame of reference for understanding what Art's generation had endured. They'd grown up with video games that made war seem like entertainment, with movies that portrayed combat as heroic adventure, and with a society that honored veterans in the abstract while remaining largely ignorant of their individual stories and struggles. Art's faded tattoo had become a symbol of this disconnect. What had once been a source of pride and identity was now so worn and unclear that its significance was lost on anyone who hadn't lived through the era it represented. The sharp lines had blurred, the colors had faded, and the words beneath the eagle globe and anchor were barely legible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. The morning that changed everything began like countless others in Art's carefully structured routine. He arrived at Murphy's Diner at exactly 7:30 a.m., ordered his usual black coffee and wheat toast, and settled into his preferred booth by the window, where he could watch the neighborhood come alive with the start of another day. The morning regulars nodded their acknowledgments. The postal worker grabbing coffee before his route, the nurse finishing her night shift, the construction crew fueling up before heading to their job site. But this particular Wednesday brought an unwelcome addition to the usual crowd. Chad Morrison had arrived for his shift in an unusually boisterous mood, accompanied by three friends who had apparently spent the previous evening celebrating something that had left them loud, obnoxious, and looking for entertainment at other people's expense. Art had been quietly reading the newspaper when Chad's voice first cut through the morning calm. "Hey, check out the fossil in the corner booth. Look at that ancient tattoo. I bet it's older than my car." The comment drew snickers from Chad's friends, but Art had initially tried to ignore it, hoping the young men would lose interest and move on to other topics. He'd learned over the years that responding to such comments usually only made things worse, and he preferred to maintain his dignity through silence rather than engage in confrontations he was unlikely to win. But Chad was persistent, emboldened by his audience, and apparently determined to make Art the centerpiece of his morning entertainment. "Seriously, old man, what is that supposed to be? It looks like someone spilled ink on your arm and you decided to keep it." Art's hand moved instinctively to cover the tattoo, a gesture that only seemed to encourage Chad's performance. "Oh, come on, don't be shy. We're all curious about your body art. Is it supposed to be a bird? A fish? Maybe a really abstract portrait of your wife?" The mention of Rosa, even in such a casual and unknowing context, hit Art like a physical blow. His wife had loved his tattoo, had traced its lines with her finger. During quiet moments had understood its significance, even when the rest of the world seemed to have forgotten. The idea that this young man was mocking something that connected him to both his fallen comrades and his beloved wife was almost unbearable. "Leave him alone, Chad," came a quiet voice from across the diner. 8-year-old Ethan Rodriguez was sitting with his grandmother Maria, who brought him to the diner every Wednesday before school as part of their special tradition. Ethan had been watching the interaction with the kind of intense focus that children bring to adult conflicts they don't fully understand, but instinctively recognize as wrong. Chad turned his attention to the boy with mock surprise. "Oh, look, the kid's defending Grandpa. That's sweet, but maybe you should mind your own business, little man." But Ethan wasn't deterred. Something about Art's quiet dignity in the face of ridicule had struck a chord with the boy, whose own grandfather had served in Korea and had taught him to respect those who had worn the uniform. "My grandpa says people with military tattoos are heroes. Maybe you should ask him about it instead of making fun." Chad's response revealed the depth of his ignorance and insensitivity. "Military tattoo, that blob of faded ink, kid, that looks more like a mistake than a military decoration." That's when Art made his crucial decision. Instead of continuing to endure the humiliation in silence, instead of leaving the diner and never returning, he decided to stand up for himself and for the memory of the men who had died beside him in the jungles of Vietnam. "It's the eagle globe and anchor," Art said quietly, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent diner. "United States Marine Corps, 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion, Vietnam 1970 to 1971. The silence that followed Art's revelation was profound and uncomfortable. Chad's smirk faltered as he realized he might have misjudged the situation, but his pride in the presence of his friends prevented him from backing down gracefully. Instead, he doubled down on his mockery, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Vietnam, huh? Well, that explains why it looks so old and faded. Maybe you should have gotten it touched up somewhere along the way. Art's response was measured but firm. This tattoo was done by a Marine named Jimmy Santos in Da Nang. He was 19 years old and he was killed 2 weeks later. I wouldn't change a single line of his work. The weight of Art's words settled over the diner like a heavy blanket. Even Chad's friends seemed uncomfortable now, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact. But Chad, perhaps sensing that retreat would mean losing face, pushed forward with his performance. Look, I'm sure your service was meaningful to you, but that doesn't mean the rest of us have to pretend that mess on your arm looks like anything other than a mistake. That's when Ethan Rodriguez did something that would change the trajectory of the entire morning. The 8-year-old slipped out of his booth and approached Art's table, his young face serious with purpose. "Sir," Ethan said with the formal politeness his grandmother had taught him, "could you tell me about your tattoo? I'd like to know what it means." Art looked down at the earnest young face and felt something shift inside him. Here was someone who wanted to understand, rather than ridicule, someone who approached his story with curiosity rather than contempt. "Well, son, it's the symbol of the Marine Corps. The eagle represents our nation, the globe shows that we serve worldwide, and the anchor connects us to our naval heritage." Ethan listened intently, his eyes focused on the faded tattoo as Art explained its significance. "What does that writing say underneath?" Art pointed to the barely legible script below the main design. "It says Semper Fi, that's Latin for always faithful, and below that it shows my unit, 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion, in the years I served." "What did you do in the war?" Ethan asked, his question innocent but profound. Art hesitated, unused to discussing his service with anyone, let alone a child. But something about Ethan's genuine interest encouraged him to continue. "I was a reconnaissance Marine. We went ahead of the main forces to gather intelligence and report on enemy positions. It was dangerous work, but it helped keep other Marines safe." Chad, watching this exchange with growing discomfort, tried to regain control of the situation. "Great, now we're getting war stories. This is exactly what I need with my morning coffee." But Ethan ignored Chad completely, his attention focused entirely on Art. "Were you a hero?" The question hit Art like a punch to the chest. He'd never considered himself a hero, just a Marine who had done his job and tried to bring his men home alive. "I don't know about that, son. I just did what I was trained to do." "But you got medals, right?" Ethan pressed. "My grandpa says Marines who go to war get medals for being brave." Art's voice grew quieter. "I received some decorations, yes. A Bronze Star for valor and a Purple Heart for wounds received in combat." The mention of specific military honors caused a ripple of recognition through the diner. Several of the older customers looked up from their meals, their expressions shifting from casual interest to respectful attention. Even Chad's friends seemed to grasp the significance of what they were hearing, but Chad himself seemed determined to maintain his dismissive attitude. "Medals, huh? Well, I guess everyone who went to Vietnam got a participation trophy." The comment was so ignorant and offensive that it drew gasps from several customers. The Bronze Star for Valor was one of the military's highest decorations for heroism in combat, and the Purple Heart was reserved for those wounded or killed in action. To dismiss these honors as participation trophies revealed a level of disrespect that even Chad's friends found uncomfortable. Art's response was quiet but devastating in its dignity. "The Bronze Star for Valor is awarded for heroic achievement in combat. I received mine for actions during the siege of Khe Sanh, where I led a patrol to rescue wounded Marines who were trapped behind enemy lines. 3 of those Marines made it home to their families because of that mission." The atmosphere in Murphy's Diner shifted dramatically when Maria Rodriguez, Ethan's grandmother, stood up from her table and walked over to where Art was sitting. Her face was pale with recognition and something approaching awe. "Senor," she said softly, "did you say you served with 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion at Khe Sanh?" Art nodded, confused by the intensity of her reaction. "Yes, ma'am, from January through April of 1971. Maria's hands trembled as she reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. "My brother, Sergeant Miguel Hernandez, served with 2nd Recon. He wrote letters about a Marine who saved his life during an ambush near the base. The Marine's name was Castellanos. Art's eyes widened as he looked at the photograph Maria held out to him. It showed a young Hispanic Marine in dress blues, his face serious but kind. The memories came flooding back. Miguel Hernandez, the squad leader, who had been pinned down by sniper fire during a patrol, the desperate crawl through enemy territory to reach him, the long carry back to friendly lines with bullets whining overhead. Miguel, Art whispered, his voice thick with emotion. How is he? I lost touch with so many of the men after we came home. Maria's eyes filled with tears. He died in 1985, cancer from the Agent Orange exposure. But he never forgot what you did for him. He named his son Arthur after you. The revelation hit the diner like a thunderbolt. Chad's mocking laughter died completely as the reality of the situation became clear. This wasn't just some old man with a faded tattoo. This was a genuine war hero whose actions had directly saved lives, whose service had earned the respect and gratitude of his fellow Marines. Ethan, sensing the gravity of the moment, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Mr. Art, what exactly did you do to save Miguel? Art's voice was barely above a whisper as he recounted the story he'd kept buried for decades. We were on a reconnaissance patrol about 2 miles from the base when we walked into an ambush. Miguel was hit in the leg and couldn't move. The enemy had us pinned down and our radio was damaged. I crawled about 300 yards through enemy fire to reach him, then carried him back to our lines. It took 4 hours. 4 hours, Maria repeated, her voice filled with wonder. Miguel said you refused to leave him, even when the other Marines thought he was dead. You kept saying, no Marine left behind. The words hung in the air like a sacred oath. Every person in the diner understood now that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone who had lived by a code of honor that transcended their everyday understanding of courage and sacrifice. Chad Morrison, faced with the undeniable truth of Art's heroism, found himself in an impossible position. His mockery had been exposed as ignorant cruelty, his dismissive attitude revealed as the shallow posturing of someone who had never faced real danger or made real sacrifices. The participation trophy comment now seemed not just wrong, but actively offensive to everyone who had witnessed this revelation. But instead of apologizing, Chad made the mistake that would define the rest of the morning. Look, I'm sure this is all very touching, but one good deed 50 years ago doesn't make someone special today. That tattoo still looks like garbage, and this whole war hero thing is just ancient history. The collective gasp from the diner was audible. Chad had just dismissed not only Art's individual heroism, but the service and sacrifice of an entire generation of veterans. His words revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what military service meant and why it deserved respect regardless of how much time had passed. That's when the door to Murphy's diner opened and 4 men in civilian clothes walked in. Their bearing, their haircuts, and the way they moved marked them immediately as military personnel. But it was the way they looked at Art, with recognition, respect, and something approaching reverence, that told everyone in the diner that the morning was about to take another dramatic turn. The 4 men who entered Murphy's diner moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit, their civilian clothes unable to disguise the bearing that marked them as Marines. The leader, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered face of a career warrior, scanned the room until his eyes settled on Art Castellanos. His expression shifted from casual interest to something approaching shock. Jesus Christ, he whispered to his companions, that's Gunny Castellanos. The use of Art's old rank, gunnery sergeant, caused heads to turn throughout the diner. Art himself looked up in confusion, unused to being recognized after so many years of anonymity. The 4 Marines approached his table with the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for high-ranking officers or Medal of Honor recipients. Gunny, the lead Marine, said, coming to attention beside Art's table, I'm Master Sergeant James Patterson, 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion. These are Staff Sergeants Rodriguez, Chen, and Williams. We're all 2nd Recon, sir, and we know your story. Art struggled to stand his arthritis, making the movement painful, but Master Sergeant Patterson gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Please, Gunny, stay seated. We're honored to meet you. Chad Morrison, watching this exchange with growing confusion and alarm, tried to interject. Look, I don't know what kind of military reunion this is supposed to be, but you're disrupting my workplace. Master Sergeant Patterson turned to look at Chad with the kind of cold assessment that made seasoned Marines uncomfortable. Son, I suggest you show some respect. You're in the presence of a living legend. Living legend? Chad's voice cracked with nervous laughter. He's just an old man with a bad tattoo who's been telling war stories. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact man with the kind of quiet intensity that came from multiple combat deployments, stepped closer to Chad. That old man is Gunnery Sergeant Arthur Castellanos, Bronze Star for Valor Purple Heart, and the Marine who single-handedly saved an entire reconnaissance team during the siege of Quezon. Single-handedly, Ethan asked, his young voice cutting through the tension. Master Sergeant Patterson knelt beside the boy, his voice gentle but filled with reverence. Son, your friend here didn't just save one Marine. When his unit was ambushed and pinned down by a full company of North Vietnamese regulars, Gunny Castellanos crawled through enemy fire for 6 hours, making multiple trips to evacuate wounded Marines. He saved 8 men that day, including 2 who were presumed dead. Art's face flushed with embarrassment. That's not... any Marine would have done the same thing. No, Gunny, Staff Sergeant Chen said firmly. Not every Marine could have done what you did. The after-action reports are part of our unit history. You crawled through 300 yards of enemy fire, made 4 separate trips to evacuate wounded, and held off an enemy assault with nothing but a .45 pistol and a handful of grenades until reinforcements arrived. The details of Art's heroism filled the diner like a sacred recitation. Each fact revealed another layer of courage and sacrifice that had been hidden beneath the surface of a quiet old man drinking coffee alone. The faded tattoo that Chad had mocked was revealed as a badge of honor, worn by someone who had earned the right to wear it through blood and valor. Maria Rodriguez, still holding the photograph of her brother, approached the Marines with tears in her eyes. Miguel Hernandez was one of the men he saved. My brother lived for 14 more years because of what this man did. Master Sergeant Patterson nodded solemnly. Ma'am, Sergeant Hernandez is mentioned by name in the citation for Gunny Castellanos' Bronze Star. Your brother wrote a letter to his commanding officer recommending that the award be upgraded to the Navy Cross. He said, and I quote, Gunny Castellanos is the finest Marine I've ever served with, and I owe him my life. The weight of this revelation settled over the diner like a blessing. Art Castellanos, the quiet old man who had been mocked and dismissed, was revealed as a genuine American hero whose actions had saved lives and whose service had earned the highest respect of his fellow Marines. Chad Morrison, faced with the undeniable truth of his mistake, found himself in an impossible position. His mockery had been exposed as ignorant cruelty directed at a man who deserved nothing but respect and gratitude. The smart thing would have been to apologize immediately and hope for forgiveness. Instead, Chad made the decision that would define the rest of his life. I don't care what he did 50 years ago. This is my workplace, and I don't have to listen to a bunch of military propaganda about some old guy's war stories. The silence that followed Chad's dismissive comment was so complete that the only sound in Murphy's diner was the soft hum of the coffee machines and the distant traffic from the street outside. Master Sergeant Patterson looked at Chad with the kind of expression that had made enemy combatants surrender without firing a shot. Son, Patterson said quietly, I'm going to give you one opportunity to reconsider what you just said. Chad, perhaps sensing that he had crossed a line from which there was no return, decided to double down on his position. I don't need to reconsider anything. This is America, and I have the right to my opinion. My opinion is that this whole military worship thing is overblown, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. He was the youngest of the 4 Marines, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that came from recent combat experience. Military worship, is that what you call respecting the men who fought and died so you could have the freedom to run your mouth? I didn't ask anyone to fight for my freedom, Chad replied, his voice rising with defensive anger. That was their choice, and I don't owe them anything for it. The comment hit the assembled Marines like a physical blow. The idea that military service was merely a personal choice that created no obligation or debt to society revealed a level of selfishness and ingratitude that left them momentarily speechless. Art Castellanos, who had been listening to the exchange with growing sadness, finally spoke. Son, you're right that it was our choice, but we made that choice so that people like you would never have to. We volunteered to face the dangers so that you could live in safety. We didn't do it for gratitude or recognition. We did it because it was our duty. Chad's response revealed the full extent of his moral bankruptcy. Duty to who? To a government that sends young men to die in foreign countries for no good reason. To a society that's moved on from all that military nonsense. Your duty was to yourself, old man. And if you were stupid enough to risk your life for strangers, that's on you. The collective intake of breath from everyone in the diner was audible. Chad had just called Art Castellanos, a Bronze Star recipient who had saved 8 lives in combat, stupid for his service and sacrifice. The insult was so profound and offensive that even his own friends looked uncomfortable. Master Sergeant Patterson's voice when he spoke carried the kind of quiet authority that had been forged in the crucible of combat leadership. Mr. Morrison, you just insulted a man who earned his place in Marine Corps history through acts of extraordinary courage. You've dismissed the service and sacrifice of every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform. And you've revealed yourself to be exactly the kind of person that warriors like Gunny Castellanos fought to protect. Someone so selfish and ungrateful that you can't even recognize heroism when it's sitting right in front of you. Chad, realizing that he had lost the support of everyone in the diner, including his own friends, made one final attempt to justify his position. Look, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but this whole thing is blown out of proportion. It's just a faded tattoo on an old man's arm. It doesn't make him special, and it doesn't mean I have to treat him like some kind of saint. That's when Margaret Murphy, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen where she had been listening to the entire confrontation. Margaret was a woman in her 60s whose own father had served in World War II, and her face was flushed with anger at what she had witnessed. Chad Morrison, she said, her voice carrying the authority of ownership and moral outrage. You're fired. Get out of my diner and don't ever come back. Chad's face went white with shock. You can't fire me for expressing my opinion. I can fire you for creating a hostile environment for my customers, Margaret replied firmly. And I can fire you for showing such profound disrespect to a war hero that you've made everyone in this room uncomfortable. You're done here. Who? The final confrontation came when Chad Morrison, realizing his job was gone and his reputation in ruins, made one last desperate attempt to salvage his dignity by attacking the very foundation of military honor and sacrifice. Fine, he shouted, his voice cracking with rage and humiliation. Fire me for telling the truth, but don't pretend this old man is some kind of hero because he got a tattoo and fought in a war that America lost anyway. Vietnam was a waste just like every other war we've fought since World War II. These so-called heroes are just old men living in the past, demanding respect for failures. The silence that followed was deafening. Chad had just dismissed not only Art's individual service, but the sacrifice of every American who had served in Vietnam, reducing their courage and suffering to a waste and their service to failure. His words revealed a level of ignorance and callousness that shocked even those who had witnessed his earlier behavior. Art Castellanos, who had endured the entire confrontation with quiet dignity, finally stood up. His arthritis made the movement painful, but his voice carried the strength of a man who had faced death and emerged victorious. Son, Art said quietly, you're right that we didn't win the war in Vietnam, but we didn't lose it either. We were abandoned by politicians and a society that grew tired of fighting. But that doesn't diminish what we did over there. We saved lives, we protected each other, and we honored our oath to serve our country. That's not failure, that's duty. Chad's final mistake was to interrupt Art's response. Duty? You call getting your friends killed duty? You call coming home to a country that didn't want you duty? You call living with the guilt of surviving when others didn't duty? The words hung in the air like a curse. Chad had just revealed that he understood exactly what Art and his generation had endured. The loss of friends, the hostile homecoming, the survivor's guilt, and he had chosen to use that knowledge as a weapon. Master Sergeant Patterson stepped forward, his face dark with controlled fury. Mr. Morrison, you just crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. You've insulted not just Gunny Castellanos, but every Marine who served with him, every family that lost a son in Vietnam, and every veteran who came home to face the kind of ignorance and hatred you've displayed here today. But it was 8-year-old Ethan Rodriguez who delivered the final blow to Chad's position. The boy walked up to Art's table, and with the solemn dignity of a child who understood that he was witnessing something important, rendered a perfect salute. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Art," Ethan said clearly. "My grandpa taught me that heroes don't ask to be called heroes. They just do what's right." Chad Morrison was escorted from Murphy's Diner by the 4 Marines, his termination becoming the least of his concerns, as word of his behavior spread throughout the community. Within days, his comments about veterans had made their way to social media, where they were shared by military support groups and veteran organizations. His prospects for future employment in the service industry evaporated as business owners throughout San Antonio learned about his treatment of Art Castellanos. Margaret Murphy, working with Master Sergeant Patterson and the other Marines, immediately implemented changes to honor the military customers who frequented her establishment. She created a wall of honor featuring photographs and stories of local veterans with Art Castellanos' Bronze Star citation and a professional photograph of him in his dress blues holding the place of honor. The transformation of Art's life was immediate and profound. The quiet old man who had eaten breakfast alone for 3 years suddenly found himself surrounded by Marines both active and retired who sought him out to hear his stories and pay their respects. The local Marine Corps League invited him to speak at their meetings, and the 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion Association made him an honorary member of their annual reunion. Master Sergeant Patterson and his team made Art's story part of their own mission, using their platform to educate young Marines about the heroes who had come before them. They arranged for Art to visit Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego, where his story became part of the curriculum teaching new Marines about the values of courage, honor, and sacrifice. Maria Rodriguez and her grandson Ethan became regular visitors to Art's table, creating an unlikely friendship that bridged generations and honored the memory of Miguel Hernandez. Ethan's school invited Art to speak on Veterans Day, where his quiet dignity and powerful story left a lasting impression on students and teachers alike. The faded tattoo that had been the source of mockery became a symbol of honor and remembrance. Art had it professionally restored by a tattoo artist who specialized in military ink, bringing back the sharp lines and clear details that had been obscured by time. But he kept one element unchanged: the slight imperfections that marked it as the work of Jimmy Santo, the 19-year-old Marine who had died 2 weeks after creating this permanent tribute to brotherhood and service. 6 months later, Chad Morrison returned to Murphy's Diner, not as an employee but as a customer seeking forgiveness. His encounter with Art Castellanos had forced him to confront his own ignorance and prejudices, leading to a painful but necessary transformation. He enrolled in a community college history course focusing on the Vietnam War, volunteered at the local VA hospital, and slowly began to understand the true cost of the freedom he had taken for granted. Art Castellanos never saw himself as a hero, but his story became a reminder that heroism often wears the quiet face of duty and sacrifice. In defending his honor and dignity, the Marines who recognized him had honored all veterans, proving that the brotherhood forged in service transcends time, rank, and circumstance. The faded tattoo had become a bridge between generations, a symbol of values that never fade, and a reminder that true honor is earned through service to others.